Welcome, everybody, and thank you for attending the International Conference on Romanticism and Its Afterlives. My name is James McKusick, and my presentation is entitled George Perkins Marsh and the Romantic Origins of American Environmentalism. This presentation will explore the afterlives of Romantic writers Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Alexander von Humboldt, as their influence was manifested in the work of the American nature writer George Perkins Marsh. Now, who was George Perkins Marsh? He was the author of a compelling environmental manifesto entitled Man and Nature, or Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action, in which he advocated for the conservation of wilderness areas and advanced the prescient idea that human activities affect local and regional climate by clearing forests, damming rivers, and draining swamps. Although Marsh seeks to understand the natural world by means of an overtly scientific methodology, his ecological worldview is fundamentally shaped by his lifelong immersion in the discourse of the American Transcendentalists, whose understanding of the natural world was profoundly affected by the poetry and prose of the Romantic movement in England and Germany. Perhaps the single most important figure in the development of a full-fledged ecological consciousness in Britain and America was Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge was the first of the English Romantic poets to articulate an organic conception of poetic form and to relate this idea to the scientific concept of the organism. In his later prose works, particularly Aids to Reflection, first published in 1825, Coleridge provided a coherent philosophical basis for regarding the natural world as pervaded by holistic and cyclical processes, a view that later sparked the development of American Transcendentalism. To be sure, Coleridge's transcendental view of the natural world has been sternly criticized by those who posit a materialistic neo-Malthusian basis for scientific ecology. Karl Kroeber, for instance, in his groundbreaking study, Ecological Literary Criticism, dismisses the latent idealism of Coleridge and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Kroeber has especially harsh words for Coleridge's allegedly narcissistic transcendentalism and for Shelley's retreat into a form of Platonic idealism. Yet it was precisely the transcendentalism of these two Romantic poets that appealed to a later generation of American nature writers, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and John Muir, and that continues to inspire such contemporary ecological visionaries as Gary Snyder and Barry Lopez. From the standpoint of intellectual history, then, the development of ecology as an empirically based science in the later 19th century would not have been possible without the previous emergence of ecological consciousness during the English Romantic period. George Perkins Marsh was one of the most prominent American environmental writers of the 19th century. Born in Woodstock, Vermont in 1801, he attended Dartmouth College from 1816 through 1820. During his time at Dartmouth College, George Marsh became well acquainted with his cousin, James Marsh, who graduated from Dartmouth College in 1817 and continued to serve as a tutor at Dartmouth College until 1820. James Marsh became a close friend and mentor for George Marsh during their time together at Dartmouth College, and the two Marsh cousins continued to keep in touch even after they graduated from college, although their careers followed very different paths. James Marsh went on to attend Andover Theological Seminary, graduating from there in 1822, and in 1824 he was ordained as a congregational clergyman. He then became a professor of languages and biblical literature, and in 1826, he was appointed as president of the University of Vermont, where he spent the rest of his career as a scholar, translator, and public intellectual. He developed a philosophy based largely upon the works of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, especially Coleridge's Aids to Reflection, of which James Marsh published the first American edition with a preliminary essay in 1829. This is the title page to that edition. Thanks in large part to the editorial and promotional work of James Marsh, Coleridge's Aids to Reflection became a massively influential work in America, particularly among the New England Transcendentalists, most notably including Emerson, Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller. James Marsh himself served as the inspirational ringleader of a transformative group of educators based at the University of Vermont and known as the Vermont Transcendentalists, who advocated for a modern, comprehensive, and intellectually exploratory curriculum for American colleges and universities. These curricular experiments were embodiments of Coleridge's idea of liberal education, which he described as that which draws forth and trains up the germ of free agency in the individual. Such a pedagogical model, grounded in Coleridge's passionate advocacy for liberal education, eventually became the standard curriculum for most American colleges and universities. And for this reason, it is difficult for contemporary academics to envision just how truly revolutionary this educational innovation was at the time of its original formation. Coleridge's Aids to Reflection, with its emphasis on freedom of inquiry and the integration of knowledge across disciplinary boundaries, provided a kind of high-octane rocket fuel for the American educational reformers of the 1820s and 30s. Although he kept in close touch with his cousin James, George Marsh followed a very different career path. After graduating from Dartmouth College, he developed a successful law practice in his home state of Vermont, but his wide-ranging mind led him to the study of English and European literature, ancient and modern languages. Indeed, he was fluent in 20 languages by the age of 30, and perhaps most important, the sciences of forestry and soil conservation. During this intense period of intellectual exploration, George Marsh continued to read widely in ways that broadened his understanding of the natural world. Through a careful reading of the first American edition of Coleridge's Aids to Reflection, George Marsh may have come to realize the ecological implications of Coleridge's concept of organicism, which bears a clear affinity with Marsh's own view of the natural world as an interdependent biological community. Another key figure in the development of Marsh's ecological awareness was Alexander von Humboldt, a German geographer, naturalist, explorer, and proponent of Romantic philosophy and science. Humboldt was the author of Views of Nature, or Ansichten der Natur, first published in 1808, which presented a colorful narrative of his travels through Central and South America and his scientific observations along the way. Humboldt was particularly fascinated by volcanoes, in large part because they embodied the unquenchable dynamism of the natural world, and his book provides a vivid account of his ascent of Chimborazo, which was then believed to be the highest mountain in the world. During his ascent, Humboldt noticed that different types of vegetation inhabited different altitude zones on the mountain. This observation led him to conceptualize the idea of isotherms, lines connecting points of equal temperature, which revolutionized climate studies. And in this diagram, you can clearly see that the mountain is divided into isothermal contours, and Humboldt painstakingly maps the distribution of vegetation from lower to higher altitudes all the way up to the snow line. Humboldt's work highlighted the interdependence of life and the environment, documenting temperature, altitude, humidity, atmospheric pressure, and the plants and animals found at each elevation. George Marsh was profoundly affected by Humboldt's views of nature, and Marsh frequently cites this influential work in his own writings on geography and climate. In 1842, George Marsh was elected to the U.S. Congress, where he distinguished himself as a steadfast conservationist, calling upon the federal government to play an active role in natural resource preservation and management. In 1849, Marsh was appointed as U.S. minister to the Ottoman Empire. During this time, he traveled extensively throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and he carefully studied the history, geography, and agriculture of this region. He sent many plant specimens back to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., before his recall to the United States in 1852. Marsh then served as a lecturer in English philology and etymology at Columbia University and the Lowell Institute, delivering a series of lectures on the history of the English language that he later published as a book in 1862. In 1861, President Abraham Lincoln appointed Marsh as the first U.S. ambassador to Italy, a position he held for the next 20 years until his death in 1882. George Marsh was the first American writer to articulate a global understanding of ecology. In 1864, he published a comprehensive treatise on the human transformation of the terrestrial environment, entitled Man and Nature, or Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action. This eloquent and persuasive book draws upon his broad geographical knowledge and his extensive reading to propose a bold and novel thesis that the entire world has been modified by human activity. Marsh argued that the ancient Mediterranean civilizations collapsed as the result of environmental degradation, caused primarily by the felling of forests, the damming of rivers, and the intensive irrigation of crops. Deforestation, in turn, led to eroded soils, decreased soil productivity, and eventually to widespread desertification. Moreover, these destructive changes had a dramatic impact on the local and regional climate. Marsh writes, "The felling of the woods has been attended with momentous consequences to the drainage of the soil, to the external configuration of its surface, and probably also to local climate. And the importance of human life as a transforming power is, perhaps, more clearly demonstrable in the influence man has thus exerted upon superficial geography than in any other result of his material effort." Marsh was clearly one of the first American scientists to investigate the effects of human activity on climate change, and his insights boldly prefigure our own contemporary concerns about global climate change. Marsh adopts a prophetic tone in describing the future devastation of the earth if human society fails to take effective action to preserve and protect the natural environment. The earth is fast becoming an unfit home for its noblest inhabitant, and another era of equal human crime and human improvidence would reduce it to such a condition of impoverished productiveness, of shattered surface, of climatic excess, as to threaten the deprivation, barbarism, and perhaps even extinction of the species. In this passage, Marsh is among the first environmental writers to envision the possible extinction of the human species as the result of a self-inflicted environmental catastrophe. Although such an eventuality might have seemed hyperbolic to Marsh's original readers, it has become a very real possibility in our own time, especially for the reason that Marsh articulates in the passage just quoted, the destructive impact of global climate change. Marsh draws upon his own observations of barren landscapes in the Middle East, now a lifeless desert where ancient civilizations once flourished. And he warns his American readers that their own bucolic rural landscapes are not immune to similar destruction, especially if current unsustainable methods of farming, forestry, and extractive industry are allowed to continue unchecked. He writes eloquently of the destruction that will inevitably result from the clear-cutting of a forest. With the disappearance of the forest, all is changed. At one season, the earth parts with its warmth by radiation to an open sky, receives at another an immoderate heat from the unobstructed rays of the sun. Hence the climate becomes excessive, and the soil is alternately parched by the fervors of summer and seared by the rigors of winter. Bleak winds sweep unresisted over its surface, drift away the snow that sheltered it from the frost, and dry up its scanty moisture. The soil is bared of its covering of leaves, broken and loosened by the plow, deprived of the fibrous rootlets which held it together, dried and pulverized by sun and wind, and at last exhausted. The face of the earth is no longer a sponge, but a dust heap. However, Marsh is not simply an environmental doomsayer. He goes on to suggest practical means by which the Earth's vital organic processes can be nurtured and restored. He recommends the adoption of sustainable methods of farming and forestry, and he passionately advocates for the preservation of remote wilderness areas. Indeed, he is one of the first American writers to envision the creation of state and national parks. He writes, "It is desirable that some large and easily accessible region of American soil should remain, as far as possible, in its primitive condition, at once a museum for the instruction of the student, a garden for the recreation of the lover of nature, and an asylum where indigenous tree and humble plant that loves the shade, and fish and fowl and four-footed beast may dwell and perpetuate their kind. The collateral advantages of the preservation of these forests would be far greater. Nature threw up these mountains and clothed them in lofty woods, that they might serve as a reservoir to supply with perennial waters the 1,000 rivers and rills that are fed by the rains and snows of the Adirondacks, and as a screen for the fertile plains of the central counties against the chilling blasts of the north wind, which meet no other barrier in their sweep from the Arctic pole. Marsh's eloquent advocacy ultimately resulted in the designation of Adirondack Park in 1892. Even today, Adirondack Park is the largest park in the contiguous United States, covering more than 6 million acres. It is larger than Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, and Glacier National Parks combined. George Marsh's ecological understanding of the natural world and his deep concern about the destructive potential of global climate change were influential in his own time, and they still resonate deeply today. Marsh's key insights about the interconnectedness of nature and society profoundly influenced Gifford Pinchot, an American forester and politician who became a key figure in establishing the National Forest Service. John Muir, an American naturalist and writer, was also inspired by Marsh's work to advocate for the preservation of wilderness areas and the establishment of national parks. As an inheritor and proponent of romantic ideas of nature, George Perkins Marsh offered an eloquent and enduring perspective on the importance of environmental stewardship in our post-industrial world. Thank you very much. Here is my list of references. I would be glad to answer any questions you may have at the end of this session. Thank you for attending the International Conference on Romanticism and Its Afterlives.